Hello, my name's Michael Pilarski, and I work for the fairies. You know, the nature spirits, the devas, the nature intelligences that work with plants and with the waters, streams, oceans, clouds. The beings that work with air, earth, water, and fire. And so I started studying about fairies in the mid-1970s, so about 45 years ago. And as being a bit of a bookworm, I've collected a few books along the way about fairies as I've been doing my studying. And so today, I'd like to introduce you to my fairy library. And here it is. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books on 7 shelves of books on fairies. And I counted them up last night. I have about 260 books at this time. And I wanted to introduce you to my favorite books today. Just the ones I think that are really
Your top 10?
capture my top 10 books on fairies. And so we're going to start with Daphne Charter's book called 40 Years with the Fairies. Now, this is the book that got me started on my whole fairy path. And Daphne's from England, and she presents a really interesting view of a group of fairies that she works with in England. And Daphne not only can see fairies, but she also talks to them. But they set up a teamwork, and they do a lot of work together, 40 years of work. And so she became very close friends, and they went off and did missions. They would go off to higher realms together. Sometimes they would go to lower realms. They go to, you might say, into the depths of hell to rescue lost souls. So they're doing remarkable work, not only in the upper realms, but the lower realms as well. So Daphne will give you a picture of fairies. She's their scribe. They tell her their stories and she writes them down. So there's stories from many different nature spirits in this book, and an in-depth look, personal look that you won't find anywhere else. So a lot of spiritual teachings in a very entertaining and exciting format. I mean, this reads like a novel. It's kind of like the Tales of Narnia or Tolkien or something like that. But this is actually her work with the fairies. So can't recommend this one highly enough, and you can get it from my website, friendsofthetrees.net. And one of the things that Daphne did working with her fairies is they put on something called the Fairy and Human Relations Congress. It was held in the fairy realm. There were very few humans there. Daphne was the only incarnate human. And they were working on how can fairies and humans work together for the world. How could they have more of a symbiosis? How can we work together? And so I was inspired years later in the year 2000, because this started in the 1950s, mind you, this Fairy Congress. But I started a Fairy and Human Relations Congress in the physical plane in 2001. So next year, 2020, is going to be our 20th anniversary of this event. 250 to 300 people show up. We have a lot of presenters, a lot of workshops, a lot of parading and fun, singing and dancing, but we're very focused on who are the fairies, how do we work with them, and how do we cooperate and communicate. So we're the real deal. We're not just a foo-foo entertainment and costuming. We are actually working with the fairy realm. So if that catches your fancy, you can visit the website fairycongress.com. It's June 24th to 27th next year in 2020 in the Methow Valley in the North Cascades of Eastern Washington.
And do the fairies look forward to your Congress every year?
Oh yes, there's so many fairies come. There are tens of thousands of fairies there. And we have orb photos that are just thick with orbs. We're going to do, Jeffrey, we'll do another video on orbs one of these days, orbs at the Fairy Congress.
Fantastic.
Because that's just one representation. But yes, we have,
So
it's
the
a big
fairies show
event.
up and they're accustomed in the valley there. They're accustomed to your event and they look forward to it every year.
Oh yes, oh yes. They set us up, you might say. So another author I really like is Marko Pogacnik, and he's from Slovenia in Europe, and he's written quite a few books now. But he has the clairvoyant sight, and he also does a lot of communication. And so this one is Nature, Spirits, and Elemental Beings, and he describes a fair amount about the fairy realm and working with the fairies and how they're operating on Earth. So Marko Pogacnik's a real good guy. And years later, he produced this book here, Sacred Geography. This is 2005. And so Marko can not only see fairies, but he also sees the earth energy. So he sees, in a sense, you might say, vortexes, the chakras of the planet, what the energy systems, the subtle energy systems of the planet look like. And so in this book, he explains what's going on in the planet and on the surface of the planet, and how he's working and how humans can work to help fix the planet up, because there's a lot of problems, as you might suspect, with the way the humans have been treating the planet. And this book is about how do we bring the planet back to health? What are the ways that we can cooperate with nature to bring the planet back to health?
So are you saying that the fairies are going to assist us with global earth repair?
Oh yes, we have to work with them. I mean, they're instrumental. We wouldn't, the Earth wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be alive without the fairy realm. So we have to work with them.
And are the fairies? Do they manage the planet? I mean, are they stewards?
They are stewards of the planet. It's a long story. We won't
read some of the books.
Read some of the books.
Okay.
So, Nature, Spirits, and What They Say by Verena Stahl von Holstein. Now, Verena is a German woman, and she has written about 20 books in German I've read, I've heard, but she's only have 4 translated into English so far. And so this is her first one, and this is a great introduction. And she not only works with nature, spirits in her neighborhood, you might say, with various trees or the landscape there, but she works with rivers and with the stone beings, sand beings, and moonlight and silver. And so she's working with beings that are, you might say, planetary in scale as well. So, and they tell her what's their viewpoint of what's going on in the world today. How are humans affecting the world?
Hold the book from the top. You're covering her name.
There we go. Okay, so this is a very good look at what fairies think of what humans are doing to the world at this time and what we might change. So this is a very, you might say, modern look. It isn't just looking at what fairies used to be like. This is what they're saying today. And I'll just throw in another one of her books right here, actually. And here's a second of her book called We Turn Our Hearts to the Earth. And the subtitle is Nature, Spirits on Oil and Human Destiny. So here she talks to the petroleum, the oil spirits, and she talks to other high beings that talk about how humans are changing the world through our use of fossil fuels and by pumping all this petroleum and what's happening as a result. So this is a real inside look at what humans are doing with this whole fossil fuel thing. It's quite astounding. So if you're so it's not a very thick volume, but there's a lot of interesting information. And Now, so those are some of the modern books. I wanted to show a few of the classics. So here's a book called The Findhorn Garden. And it was the Findhorn Garden that really started putting fairies, you might say, fairies and Devas on the map. In the 1970s, the Findhorn Garden in Scotland has become world famous. And Dorothy McLean was one of the people living there, and she was communicating with Davic beings in the garden and the landscape there, and and bringing their messages to humanity. And up to then, very little was being written about fairies in modern times. So this is a classic book. It has a lot of good information, gives you an idea of how this got going in our modern era. So this was published in 1975, and in the meantime, Findhorn Gardens has been going strong, and this is their most recent edition of the Findhorn Garden book, and so it's called The Findhorn Garden Story. It's got the messages from the Devas, basically the same information, slightly edited, but it's also got a lot of color photographs, and it's much more modern looking. So, at any rate, this is a nice looking book to give you an idea of the whole Findhorn Gardens.
Do they publish at Findhorn?
Oh yeah, they have their own publishing house there. So here is The Real World of Fairies by Dora Van Gelder. This has long been one of my favorite little books on fairies. I think I've probably read it 3-4 times. And it's Dora Van Gelder is a theosophist. She's one of the old-time members of the Theosophy Society. And the Theosophists were a group of people who studied esoteric and metaphysical, spiritual beliefs, and they have a long history. But Dora brings a clairvoyant perspective on the fairy realm. She could see them quite well, she could communicate, and so she describes here this is a really charming book on what's the fairy realm is like. And one of the interesting chapters in here is about she was relating to the Deva of the Bay of Biscayne in Florida when a hurricane comes along, and she gets a really good account of all the spiritual forces behind a hurricane. So if you read this hurricane chapter in this book, you'll never think of a hurricane the same again. There's a bunch of beings, hurricane beings behind them and orchestrating things. So at any rate, so there's Dora Van Gelder. Another more contemporary book, here's Summer with the Leprechauns by Tanis Hallowell. Tanis lives in British Columbia. She went and spent a summer in Ireland some time back and rented a cottage, and lo and behold, a leprechaun shows up, and they become friends and have been working together for quite a few years now, ever since. So this book is just a very personable, first-hand account of a friendship with a particular fairy being, a leprechaun being, and so it's just a delightful encounter, and sort of gives you an idea of how you can form a friendship, a long-time working relationship with a fairy being.
Do leprechauns need a passport?
The leprechauns are just invisible, and so they don't have to answer to anyone. At least on the physical earth plane realm here, so it's quite easy for them to get around. No plane tickets required. Here's the last book I'm going to mention today is The Complete Idiot's Guide to Elves and Fairies. And when I first saw this on the bookshelf, I said, well, this probably can't be very good. It's just made for the masses. It's just going to be really shallow. But at any rate, I picked it up because I try to buy almost every book on fairies that I come across. That's why I ended up with 260 of them here. But I was actually quite delighted when I read this book. It actually has a lot of really good information in it, and it tells you different exercises and meditations and things that you can do to work with the fairy realm. So it's very hands-on, practical information, you might say, and very digestible, easy to read. This would be a good book to introduce it to friends and family. So Sirona Knight did a good job on this. So thanks, Sirona, for putting out the Complete Idiot's Guide to Elves and Fairies. So there you have it, folks. Those are some of my favorite books, some of the classics and some of the more current ones. And in the future, I'd like to get together with Jeffrey and do some more book reviews, because we've got a lot more books here, and some of them, I must say, are less, I found less interesting than others. But I have a lot of books here that I really like, and I'd like to share more of them with you later, but only so much at a time. So do bear in mind that there's fairies wherever you live, associated with all forms of nature, and you can go out and talk to them too. And listen carefully and see if you get any reply. Come to the Fairy Congress, and there's lots of classes there on how to do these things. So be well and think well of the fairies and the nature spirits and devas. We wouldn't be here without them. Thank you. Look for ways to communicate and cooperate with the spiritual realms for the good of Earth and for the good of ourselves and for the good of humanity. There is a lot of allies for us in the spiritual realms, and it's pretty obvious that humanity needs some more allies. So for further information on the Sidhe and the nature spirits and devas, refer to some of the books I've mentioned. Look up other ones yourselves. Do some study, follow your spiritual practices, whatever they may be. And you can find out further information by going to the Fairy and Human Relations Congress website, fairycongress.com, or my website is friendsofthetrees.net. If you're interested in attending the Fairy and Human Relations Congress next year, June 24th to 27th, 2020, in the Methow Valley of the Eastern Cascades in Washington State. We'll be there with lots of really interesting people and fun people and fairies. Bye-bye. If you bump into any fairies as you're going through life, be nice to them and say hi for me.